And something that some people don't know is the entity behind all this. Paxton and Texans for Lawsuit Reform have had a running gun battle for at least the last 2 election cycles. Don't ask me why.
I think because of their power and their ability to raise lots of money from very wealthy people in Texas, they view themselves as invincible, and I think they also view themselves as having a right to do whatever to anybody they want to because they are powerful.
In the weeks before Ken Paxton's impeachment trial, Republican voters clamored for the charges to be dismissed before the trial even began. There was a concerted push by voters and advocacy groups that tried to stop the proceeding in its tracks, an effort that appeared to be gaining traction. At this critical juncture, a group renowned for moving in the shadows stepped out, and for once advocated for something they were created to stop: a frivolous trial. After months of denying involvement and distancing itself from the affair, TLR issued a press release directly advocating for the Senate to proceed with a trial. And that wasn't all TLR was up to. In this episode, we'll track TLR in the shadows, talk to insiders who have been working to overcome the backroom influence of the organization for decades, and shine a spotlight on the very public fight TLR picked with the Texas GOP voters by trying to take out Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. From Texas Scorecard, I'm Valerie Munoz, and this is Exposed, the Beast of Austin.
Is justice for sale in Texas?
TLR, I think, can crown itself with the laurel that they are responsible for taking a legal system and turning it into the model.
I think because of their power and their ability to raise lots of money from very wealthy people in Texas, they view themselves as invincible.
It's morphed into a beast of Austin.
I think Texas for Lawsuit Reform has long since passed its prime. It is on another path. It should just go away.
He said the House was not following the rule of law. He said the House approach, and I quote, Representative Smithy, hang them now and judge them later.
If an elected official like Ken Paxton, who had a lot of background in the legislature and then as Attorney General, started getting, in their estimation, a little too Trumpian, I think the derangement set in, and pretty soon you have them, rifling through, like, who do we have here that we can used to take out Ken Paxton, that he's just become too grassroots friendly and he's no longer attuned to our agenda.
That's Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and attorney Mark Pulliam speaking about the attempted coup of Ken Paxton. In the final days of the legislative session, the House Investigations Committee announced it would impeach Paxton after former employees accused the Attorney General of bribery and abuse of office. Here's State Representative John Smithy talking about the rushed process to impeach Paxton.
The rules were made up as we went in this process, and that's not the way it should be. It's like dumping information late on a Friday afternoon of a news cycle. We should be doing this in the open daylight. We should be doing it not with 48 hours notice. We actually had less than 24 hours notice that we were going to do this today. They have always said that the accused, in this case General Paxton, had the right to be represented by counsel during the proceedings. There is no indication in the record that General Paxton was ever afforded that opportunity.
He wasn't alone in this assessment. Mark Pulliam explains the dynamic further.
When this impeachment came up, I thought, well, this is just frivolous. This is crazy. In my view, this was exactly, the establishment, the rhino establishment versus the conservative grassroots. You had all those elements going on in the Texas House.
Before the Texas Senate took up the rushed impeachment of Ken Paxton, TLR had been claiming they had nothing to do with the effort. After these public denials and being launched into what was dubbed in the press a civil war within the Texas GOP, TLR issued their public statement, lobbying the Senate to hold the trial. Discovery produced during the trial would cast doubt on TLR's denials. Documents provided to the Paxton defense team showed Dick Trabolsi, the chairman of TLR PAC, collaborating with political strategist Karl Rove to plant editorials in the Wall Street Journal advocating for Paxton's impeachment to proceed.
He sent you a text, didn't he?
That's Ken Paxton's defense attorney, Tony Busby, cross-examining a former employee of Attorney General Paxton. It was a rogue group of former employees whose accusations led to the impeachment trial, and Busby was curious about their contact with Dick Trabolsi.
He sent me a text after I resigned.
A text of support?
I got many texts of support. He was one of them, yes.
So just so we're all clear, and everybody's watching is clear, you were having conversations with the leader of Texans for lawsuit reform who was showing support for you after you'd went to the FBI and resigned.
TLR's support for Ken Paxton's impeachment wouldn't have come as a surprise to political observers. As you heard Tony Busby mention in the introduction to this episode, the group has been battling with Paxton for some time. Here's Paxton's take on the relationship.
When I ran for the House, they didn't know me, so they didn't support me. That to me was perfectly understandable. Now, 10 years later, I ran for the Texas Senate, and my voting record was clear. I voted with them 100% of the time. And yet they came to me after 10 years of supporting their positions and said, we're not supporting you for Texas Senate.
After not being helpful in Paxton's 2012 Senate run, TLR would go on to spend millions of dollars backing Eva Guzman's failed campaign to defeat Paxton in the 2022 Republican primary. As Paxton put it,
instead of making things good with me and trying to work things out for the future, they decided, no, let's work on this internal plot.
Adversarial during the campaign, TLR had allies in the Attorney General's office who would work to undermine Paxton when the opportunity arose.
I knew that Dick Weekly had a relationship with Blake Brickman, one of the whistleblowers, his father, home builder, and they had connected, and I think they had him in my office to do exactly what he did. He was a plant.
Paxton's defense attorney, Tony Busby, appeared on a podcast following the impeachment unraveling.
Brickman even said in his little unsworn statement that he was the one that put it all together. He's the one that put all the pieces together. He was the driving force behind, and you could tell how his demeanor was. He was the driving force behind all this. That's why he was very upset when he testified, because the whole thing crumbled.
And meanwhile, TLR was working behind the scenes to drum up public support to remove Paxton, according to Mark Pulliam.
Lo and behold, I uncovered this cache of emails which showed that, in particular, an op-ed that ran under the byline of Rick Perry in the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal was no fan of Ken Paxton. They were beating the drum to have him impeached. That this op-ed apparently was not written by Rick Perry after all, was apparently written by Karl Rove and placed in the Wall Street Journal through the auspices of the TLR communications department. And there's a trail of emails, including some emails back and forth between Karl Rove and Dick Trabolsi showing that, or at least appearing to show that. And I wrote about that in the Federalist, and I have not received any requests for retraction or correction or any pushback whatsoever, I think because it's true. This is the way it happened. And so the idea that TLR, after it made what I consider to be a ill-conceived political judgment to take out Ken Paxton, after spending millions of dollars, wasting millions of dollars of their donors' money, pushing Eva Guzman, instead of respecting the wishes of the electorate, to then use more of their resources to surreptitiously, put these phony op-eds in the Wall Street Journal trying to undermine Ken Paxton while the Senate was deliberating. That has nothing to do with promoting tort reform. That has nothing to do with fighting to preserve the Texas miracle. That's just rhino politics. And I was frankly disappointed and disgusted to see that this organization that I had supported, that I had spoken on behalf of, would now be engaged in political skullduggery of this sort.
TLR's clandestine turned public aggression towards Paxton is the most blatant example of the group working against the will of Texas voters. But this isn't a recent development in their posture towards Paxton. The year after Ken Paxton was elected Attorney General, TLR lobbied to limit the power of the Attorney General's office to pursue civil penalties, including a per-violation penalty of $20,000 under the Deceptive Trade Practice Act, Senate Bill 2140 reduced the per violation penalty to $10,000.
I am very pro-business. What I'm not for is fraud. And the things that TLR works now on, and this is why we are divergent, they come into the legislature and try to undo the Attorney General's office to go after that fraud, whether it's through nuisance law or through the Deceptive Trade Practices Act.
As far back as 2012, conservative watchdogs were critical of the changing role TLR was playing in Texas politics. Here's Mark Pulliam addressing the issue of TLR's idle hands making mischief.
There's a certain amount of hubris that goes along. Once you acquire this power and status, you want to maintain this power and status. And eventually, they sort of ran out of tort issues to solve.
TLR isn't just maneuvering for power in Austin. It's actively working to undermine sound laws aimed at protecting Texans like you from frivolous lawsuits.
I really wish that voters out there knew how important the Texas Citizens Participation Act is to their ability to speak freely. I think a lot of people take it for granted.
That's attorney Tony McDonald talking about the Texas Citizens Participation Act, which is often referred to simply as the Act. The Act, in a nutshell, bolsters the First Amendment rights of Texans by protecting public participation. Often, companies or very rich individuals who can afford to pay lawyers in forever litigation sue individuals and media companies into bankruptcy, silencing critics with litigation. Here's McDonald.
The Texas Citizens Participation Act is the most important statute in the country, or in the state, in terms of protecting people from abusive litigation.
Under the Act, the individual who has been sued can file a motion to dismiss the lawsuit on the grounds that it is intended to intimidate or silence the individual. When this type of motion to dismiss is filed, all legal proceedings must stop until the court has ruled on the motion and any appeals of the ruling have been resolved. This keeps the cost of being sued down and expedites the case. Starting in 2019, TLR has pushed lawmakers to undermine the Act as it was originally written and limit its protections. Filed and passed in 2019, House Bill 2730 by State Representative Jeff Leach started to limit the scope of protection afforded to Texans under the Act. TLR testified for the bill alongside trial lawyers. The 2019 effort to limit the Act was followed up again in 2023. Carried by Leach in the House, TLR supported Senate Bill 896, a bill that would have made it more difficult for individuals and media entities to defend themselves against lawsuits and limit automatic stays. Here's McDonald again. That's
kind of the role that TLR played in it, was pushing to cut this appellate right off, and thankfully it eventually failed in the House. Continuing, McDonald elaborates on who has traditionally supported the Act and reiterates why it is important. The media entities were working against this change because they want to defend the TCPA and they believe in it. They've fought for that law for a long time, and it does protect them. But it's really more important for the blogger, for the person who goes on Twitter or Facebook and says something. I mean, it's really more critical for those people than it is for institutional media actors.
Was there a need for Texans for Lawsuit Reform to continue to be a behemoth in Texas politics after, call it, 2011?
No.
Be sure to tune in next time when we explore how the largest privately directed PAC in Texas is overpowering the will of Texas voters. Thank you for listening to this episode of Exposed. We'd like to thank Ken Paxton, Mark Pulliam, and Tony McDonald for taking part in the interviews featured in this episode.
Exposed is a product of Texas Scorecard, the leading source on government and culture in Texas. For more information, go to texasscorecard.com.